Thank you. Thank you, Anthony, and thank you, Alex. It's an honor to be here with you all. Thank you for coming out on a Friday night. And thank you, Anthony, in particular for your words about my colleagues. These were two women who I knew and had worked with, and this is a big loss for the AP. I don't want to dwell on it, but I think there is some relevance just to talk briefly about this with this group tonight. Anya and Kathy were shot as they were covering a story about Afghanistan's elections this weekend. They were in their car, and they were part of a convoy that was being protected by Afghan security forces. And as they sat there, a policeman came up and shouted, "God is great," and then opened fire with his AK-47. And Anya was killed instantly. So what we're talking tonight about is when religion and media come together. There are members of departments from both of these departments here tonight. And that's what I do. I'm the Vatican correspondent, so religion and media coming together. I report about the church, I report about the Pope. It's a pretty low-risk affair. But what happened in Afghanistan is a reminder that there is another side of reporting, that it is dangerous, as Anthony mentioned. And reporting on issues that have religious undercurrents to them can be particularly dangerous. There's no indication that this attack was obviously religiously motivated per se, but this is Afghanistan. And if you think about it, much of what is news around the world today is actually about religion. You think wars, a lot of the wars today, a lot of the conflicts have religious undercurrents to them. Politics, it's all about religion. So very often you'll find there's an issue of faith that drives the debate. And because religion is intertwined with daily life, what many journalists do boils down to reporting about religion, either directly or indirectly. In my case, it's pretty direct. I cover the Vatican. But a lot of what I actually write about ends up being about politics, sex, culture, life, and death. I'm going to talk a bit about that now and hopefully shift the tone away from this sad story. But I think it might not be a bad idea to keep in mind that when religion and media do intersect, it can be a very fraught affair. Emotions are high. Religion matters to people. They take it very seriously. And I keep that in mind when I report, because I know that there are 1.2 billion people out there for whom the Pope is the vicar of Christ on earth. And it's a big responsibility to report accurately and fairly about him and what he and the Vatican are doing. It's a fascinating job. It can be challenging, boring, frustrating. The Vatican is not an open place for reporters. When I have downtime, I do some housekeeping. Last week, I wrote Pope Francis's obituary. I don't have any inside information that he's sick. He seems remarkably healthy for someone his age, and he only has one full lung, so it's something that we have to keep on top of. But as a journalist who covers the Vatican, I have to be ready for the day he dies, because he will die. And the most important thing that happens on my beat is when the Pope dies, because that sets in motion one of the most remarkable pieces of theater that the world never sees, and that's a conclave to elect a new pope. Now, last year, Pope Benedict, he didn't die, but he retired, and that made the transition even more dramatic. It had been 600 years since a pope stepped down, and there was no precedent for what Benedict had planned. So all of a sudden, we now have two popes, one reigning and one retired, living side by side in the Vatican gardens. This new normal, two men in white, each one is called Your Holiness. Each one receives visitors in the Vatican who kiss his ring. That has some really important implications for the Vatican and for the Church and for what journalists have to do. Benedict is increasingly taking on a more visible role in the public life of the Church, and that's at Francis's express wishes. He wants to have him around. He's writing prefaces to books again. He's holding court, receiving visitors. He made a cameo appearance back in February when a bunch of new cardinals received their red hats. We probably will see him again at the end of the month when Pope John Paul II and John the 23rd are made saints. So that gives us a pretty good starting point to look at how things have changed over the past year that Francis has been Pope and what's in store under this new regime. I've covered 3 popes, mostly Benedict and Francis. These men could not be any more different in their personalities. Benedict is terribly, painfully shy. Some say he's cold, indifferent. He's not. He's just a gentle soul who's very, very shy. He entered the seminary as a young boy, so he's lived his life in the church. He's an academic, a theologian. When he was a cardinal, he had this fantastic library that when he became Pope, he moved it book by book in the same exact place into the Apostolic Palace so that he had his books with him. Those books have now been moved again in the same order into the library of the little monastery where he's living. He's German, and that's important. Francis, on the other hand, lived the life of a pretty normal Argentine schoolboy before deciding to become a priest. He loved soccer, and he still does. They say he was a bouncer at a nightclub. When he finally took the plunge and entered the seminary, he had dreams of being a missionary. He wanted to go to Japan to spread the faith and the great tradition that the Jesuits are known for. But because of his precarious health, that lung situation that I told you about, the Jesuit superior kept him in Argentina. And so he started being a missionary in the slums of Buenos Aires, and so he preached to the prostitutes and the poor and the prisoners and the drug addicts. And that contact with real people and people with problems, their problems and how they care for themselves and their families, that formed him as a person and a priest, and now as a pope. In terms of church teaching, they're both coming from the same page. Don't let Francis's popular appeal mislead you. He is a conservative Catholic just like Benedict. Francis likes to call himself a son of the church. In fact, after he was superior of the Jesuits in his native Argentina, he was effectively exiled by the more progressive members in his order because his conservative bent really didn't jive with the progressive wing that was running the order at the time. But while Benedict and Francis are both very conservative, their tone and emphasis are vastly different. For 25 years, Benedict was in charge of the Vatican office that was responsible for making rules. He was the one who was in charge of enforcing the rules, reminding Catholics what the rules were, explaining why the church had the rules to begin with. Francis doesn't really care much about rules. He likes to break rules. And just yesterday, he declared 3 more people saints, just like that. He didn't think the Vatican needed to go through the very time-consuming and expensive process of having the Vatican certify that a miracle could be attributed to this person's intercession. So much for rules. It seems like Francis believes that rules are there to serve a purpose, and in the case of saints, to really determine if this person is really worthy of being called a saint. If that purpose is achieved without the rules, so be it. In the case of these 3 new saints, Francis believed they had the universal, they were already considered saints by many in the universal church, so we don't need to go through the process of making it official. That same logic was on view 2 weeks after he was elected. It was Holy Week, and Francis broke the Vatican's own rule about the ritual where the Pope washes the feet of 12 people on Holy Thursday. The Vatican rules say it should only be done on men because Jesus' apostles were men. Francis not only performed the ritual on women, he washed the feet of 2 Muslims as well. For him, the Holy Thursday foot washing ritual is a gesture of mercy and service to show how Jesus served others. For Francis, this concept of service then extends to men, women, Christian, and Muslims. Now, Francis is not breaking all the rules. There are some rules which form the core of church doctrine, and those are not going to change. He is absolutely against abortion. When he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires, he lobbied hard, albeit unsuccessfully, to prevent Argentina from becoming the first Latin American country to legalize same-sex weddings. So for the big rules, yes, Francis is very much on board with the rules, but he doesn't harp on them. And as for the other rules that sometimes consume the moral theologians and the canon lawyers, well, he finds that the church has too many of these small-minded rules, which he's called them, and that the church should rather focus on getting out into the streets and minister to the poor. His concern is mercy, not morals. He says he wants the church to be a field hospital for wounded souls where all feel welcome. Now, Benedict wasn't indifferent to the poor or to the marginalized. He wrote an entire encyclical about the need for charity, and he frequently spoke out about economic injustice. But he also once said that the church might have to go the way of the mustard seed and become a smaller but purer church to retain its true identity. So while they are different in personality and background and emphasis, Francis is remarkably solicitous to Benedict. He says that having him around the Vatican is like having a wise old grandfather living at home. It recently came out that one of the first people Francis called when he was elected Pope was Pope Benedict. He called the papal summer residence outside of Rome at Castel Gandolfo, where Benedict had gone to live after he stepped down. Francis called up just a few minutes after he was elected, but nobody picked up the phone. Benedict's secretary recently revealed that he and Benedict were glued to the television set that night, just like the rest of us, watching to see which one of the cardinals in the Sistine Chapel would step out onto the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica and be introduced to the world as the new pope. They didn't hear the Pope's phone call. Francis's attitude towards Benedict is very much in keeping with his attitude toward the elderly in general. He believes that they have something important to offer to the younger generations, a lifetime of wisdom and experience, and shouldn't be shut away in old folks' homes. And that attitude has informed how he treats Benedict. Do you know that after he wrote his first major document about what his papacy was going to be about, this is the Apostolic Exhortation, The Joy of the Gospel, he asked Benedict for his thoughts. He gave the very first copy of it to Benedict and asked him to write down a few notes on the inside cover page. Benedict came back with 4 pages of written commentary. We have no idea what Benedict wrote. We don't know if Francis took his comments to heart. But clearly we have 2 popes at work here. Benedict, though, is exceedingly discreet. In one of his final public appearances as pope, he promised that he would be hidden from the world in retirement. And he truly meant it. He fully expected to live a relatively hermetic existence inside the monastery in the Vatican. He pledged his obedience to Francis, and there is no question about who is the reigning pope. But Francis has had other ideas. He's coaxed Benedict out of retirement. Benedict still has a mind and he still has ideas, and Francis is apparently more than happy to have him around to offer them. So now let's start looking at some of the big themes, the issues that both popes have had to deal with. And from what Anthony has told me, interfaith issues are of great interest here at Elon. They're of great interest at the Vatican as well. There's an entire office at the Vatican devoted to interreligious dialogue, so relations with Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists. Another one is devoted to ecumenical issues, relations with Christians, Protestants, Anglicans, Orthodox Christians, etc. Interestingly enough, the office that deals with relations with Jews is part of the Vatican's Congregation for Christian Unity. That's the ecumenical office. So it's not part of the office that deals with other faiths. And that tells you something about the very privileged place that Catholic-Jewish dialogue has for the Vatican. It's treated as if it were one of the Christian religions almost. Benedict had a long and very positive relationship with the Jewish community, starting from when he was a cardinal. It was very much on an academic level, but his theological works and his attitude toward the Jews cemented the relationship that began under Pope John Paul II. You'll recall it was John Paul who, during a 2000 visit to Jerusalem, famously tucked that piece of paper into the Western Wall, asking for forgiveness for centuries of Christian persecution of Jews. So Benedict furthered that relationship launched by John Paul. He visited synagogues, and perhaps most importantly, he issued a sweeping exoneration of the Jewish people for the death of Jesus Christ. He did it in 2011 in the second book of his trilogy of Jesus of Nazareth. And in that, he explained biblically and theologically why there is no basis in Scripture for the argument that the Jewish people as a whole were responsible for Jesus' death. Nevertheless, there were some serious missteps and mixed messages during his papacy. Perhaps you remember in 2009, he lifted the excommunication of a bishop who had denied the Holocaust. He denied that any Jews were gassed in the Nazi death camps. Benedict didn't know that this bishop was a Holocaust denier, and he apologized for having rehabilitated him, but it was a serious gaffe, and it rightly enraged the Jewish community. The outrage only compounded some concerns within the Jewish community about Benedict's admiration for Pope Pius XII. Pius was Pope during World War II, and some Jews say he didn't speak out enough against the Holocaust. Benedict moved Pius a step closer to sainthood when he confirmed that he had lived a life of heroic Christian virtue, so that was another problem in his relations with the Jews. Those were some serious setbacks, but Benedict eventually overcame them. If you talk to any Jewish leader who deals with the Vatican on Catholic-Jewish dialogue, they cannot say enough good things about Benedict. His relations with Muslims were another matter. He pretty much enraged the Muslim community very early on in his papacy when he famously delivered a speech in Germany in which he quoted a Byzantine emperor who characterized some of the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad as evil and inhuman, particularly his command to spread by the sword the faith. Now, Francis's interfaith credentials are vastly different. First of all, he's not a theologian, he's a pastor, and his relations with people of other faiths have been based on personal relationships that he forged over the years in Buenos Aires, which is home to one of the largest Jewish communities in Latin America. As Archbishop, he held an interfaith ceremony each year in Buenos Aires' Grand Cathedral to mark the Kristallnacht, the night in 1938 when nearly 200 synagogues were destroyed, Jewish shops were looted, and tens of thousands of Jews were sent to be exterminated. He held prayer services with Muslims, Protestants, Jews, and Orthodox Christians to pray for peace. He wrote a book with a rabbi. Now that he's Pope, nothing has changed. In fact, his interfaith initiatives have gone global and gotten global attention. A few months ago, he kosherized the Vatican's kitchen because he was hosting a luncheon for some visiting Jews. Do you know what that involves? That involves bringing a rabbi in to oversee the scrubbing of the countertops, the boiling of the utensils, the scorching of the oven, to render it fit to prepare food under Judaism's dietary laws. That doesn't happen every day at the Vatican. He recently hosted a group of Argentine Jews and Muslims who did a reconnaissance mission of sorts in the Holy Land ahead of his trip next month. Francis is going to Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinian territories primarily to meet with the spiritual leader of the world's Orthodox Christians. He's going there to mark the 50th anniversary of the landmark meeting in Jerusalem between the then Patriarch and Pope Paul VI. So Francis will be going there to talk about Israeli and Palestinian peace, but his main aim is to pray with the Orthodox Patriarch in the Church of the Nativity. Recently, on another ecumenical issue, he made a video for a group of Pentecostals. It's gone viral on YouTube. He let a Pentecostal preacher who's an old friend of his shoot a short 7-minute monologue inside the Vatican Hotel where Francis lives. Now, the Pentecostals are the main competition for the Roman Catholic Church in much of Latin America. Many in the Catholic Church consider the Pentecostal movements to be sects that are poaching Catholic souls away. But the Pope said that he yearned for a time when Pentecostals and Catholics could be united. He said he was praying for his brothers, the Pentecostals. The video was shown at a big Pentecostal conference in the US a few weeks ago, and the Pentecostals offered their prayers back to the Pope. At one time, they were speaking in tongues. Some people say that this little informal video that Francis shot one afternoon in the hotel has done more to mend ties between Catholics and Pentecostals than 4 decades of official dialogue. And let's not even talk about the atheists. Francis had said that even atheists can find salvation. It's a lot of fun to cover the Pope. I get to travel with him around the world. Every time he leaves Italy, he takes a plane full of reporters with him, usually 60 or 70 of us, between reporters, TV crews, photographers. media from all around the world vie to get on that plane. The Associated Press gets a seat pretty much no matter what. We are an international news agency, the oldest in the world, with thousands of clients and subscribers around the world. The Vatican respects us, so we get a seat. I traveled with Benedict to Mexico and Cuba, Croatia, England, and Spain, and I was on that airplane coming home from Rio de Janeiro when Pope Francis famously said, "Who am I to judge?" talking about the gays. And I'll tell you how that came about in just a minute. But I want to give you just a little bit of history on these plane trips. Pope John Paul used to do these amazing press conferences on his plane trips. They were very unscripted and a bit chaotic, and pretty much anything was fair game. And for a reporter, that's heaven. You've got a pope in front of you, confined to an airplane, and you can pretty much ask him anything you want. Benedict started out that way, but he got into some trouble on a trip to Africa. The Vatican should have known that someone was going to ask him about condoms. It was in the news at that time, and the Vatican had been in a bit of a knot because a Vatican cardinal had said that he had sparked some controversy by saying that condoms actually make the HIV and AIDS crisis worse because it gives people who use them a false sense of security. That caused a lot of outrage, particularly among public health officials in Africa, where AIDS and HIV was endemic. So when someone asked Benedict on the airplane his view about whether condoms could be condoned as a way to prevent the spread of HIV, Benedict seemed somewhat unprepared, and he essentially repeated that controversial line of the cardinal that condoms actually make the situation worse. Well, that issue dogged Benedict for a long time, and it wasn't until he wrote a book in 2010 that he cleared up his views on the subject. But ever since then, reporters have had to submit questions about a week in advance to the Vatican spokesman, who then would give them to the Pope to pick and choose the 3 or 4 that he wanted to answer on these airborne press conferences. Of course, he would then have all the time in the world to prepare the responses. The Associated Press never submitted questions in this way in a protest over what we considered to be a charade of a press conference. That's not a press conference in my book. You don't submit questions in advance. We would dutifully report on what the Pope said, but we wouldn't call it a press conference. We would explain how these comments came out, and we would never submit questions in advance. It goes against our ethical standards. Francis, though, is something different. Everyone knew going into his first trip to Rio that he doesn't particularly like reporters. We knew that from his days as Archbishop in Buenos Aires. He rarely granted interviews. He told us himself on the way over to Rio that he finds interviews tiresome. So we didn't know what to expect on the way home from Rio. But we were there. It was a 12-and-a-half-hour plane ride. We were just hoping that he might come back and talk to us. And soon enough, after takeoff, the Vatican spokesman came to the back of the plane and told us to get ready. The Pope was going to come, and he would speak with us. But we had no idea what he had planned. Would he take 1 question, 2 questions? Would he just talk to us without taking any questions? Not knowing one way or another, we quickly broke up into different language groups. The Italian reporters huddled together for a bit. The English reporters huddled together. Spanish, French. We wanted to get together because we thought that maybe each language group might be able to submit a question to him, not knowing, again, how many he would take. Within those language groups, then, there was a huddle as to what the question should be if we get called on. You've got to understand that there are vastly different types of reporters on these planes. There's the agency reporters like me. You'll have the local Brazilian radio station. They might want to ask a question about what the Pope thought of Rio. You know, that's not very interesting to me, the AP, but it's of critical interest to the Brazilian media. You have religious media who are writing for the Catholic News Service, Catholic News Agency. They have different interests, different questions that they would want to ask. So we huddled to make sure that at least we had a good representation of questions in case one of us got called on. We all then submitted our names to Father Lombardi, the Vatican spokesman. who dutifully took down our names. There were at least 25 or 30 of us, and he seemed a bit dubious that even a fraction of us would get to ask our question, but he gamely took each name down. And then the Pope came out. He made some opening remarks and then started taking questions. And one by one, Father Lombardi called each one of us to take the microphone and ask our question. And one by one, the Pope answered each of our questions. He didn't dodge a single one. There was turbulence. This man had just spent 7 grueling days in Rio. We were exhausted. He was exhausted. But he stayed on his feet for nearly 90 minutes, taking each and every one of our questions, even the difficult ones. And there had been a bit of a problem about one of Francis's advisors, who, according to some Italian news reports, had had a gay scandal in his background. So the Pope thanked the reporter for asking him about this, Monsignor. He clearly wanted to say something. And then he said it. You know, if someone has sinned and repented and is looking for God, who am I to judge? And that was it. And that line has pretty much defined the papacy. And it was pretty exciting to be there to hear it. Now, what to do with that quote? We all had a 12-hour plane ride ahead of us. Collectively, the reporters set an embargo for when we would run with the story once we landed. We could have filed from the plane. There were satellite phones, but it would have been hairy doing it. So we decided to set an embargo for an hour or two after we landed. And I spent the next 11 or 12 hours transcribing the press conference from the tape recorder that I always have with me. For these papal press conferences on airplanes, I always carry a roll of duct tape with me, so I can tape my tape recorder up to the PA system on the cabin of the airplane, so I can get a clear reporting of what the Pope is saying over the drum of the engines. So I transcribed the press conference, wrote the story, and as soon as I landed, while I was waiting for my luggage to come out, sent it to my editor in London, and it moved as soon as the embargo lifted. So papal trips are one important and very cool part of what Vatican reporters get to do. You see the Pope in a vastly different light. You're watching him around the clock and paying attention to the 2, 3, or 4 speeches a day that he'll deliver. You'll see how he interacts with world leaders, with crowds, and you'll see the unscripted moments when even the best laid plans and protocol go out the window. Papal trips are tough. We get up very early to retrieve the prepared texts of his speeches and get in place for the security checks and transport to wherever the Pope will be. Much of the time, the print reporters can spend at least part of the day at a press center that has been erected for the event with Wi-Fi and big screen televisions that will be carrying a live feed of what the Pope is doing. And so while these papal trips are important and fascinating, the vast majority of our time reporting takes place in Rome, and that's where there's a Vatican press office inside the Vatican. And I'll tell you a little bit about the Vatican because it's an interesting place. It's a walled city-state, 110 acres of gardens and palazzos in the center of Rome. It's its own sovereign state. That means it has its own currency and stamps. It issues its own passports and license plates. It has its own army, the Swiss Guards, and it has embassies around the world and diplomatic relations with 176 states. The Pope is the supreme head of the Holy See, which is the central government of the 1.2 billion strong Catholic Church. He's an absolute monarch. He has supreme executive, legislative, and judicial power. He's also the ruler of the Vatican City-State. That's the actual territory where the Vatican is located. That territory includes the famous Vatican museums, the Sistine Chapel. Inside the Vatican wall, there's a supermarket with great food and great prices. There's a pharmacy and a gas station and a department store. All of them are tax-free, which in a country with a 21% sales tax comes to quite a nifty savings. But guess what? All those perks, the supermarket and the duty-free department store, are only for Vatican citizens and employees. I can't shop there, and neither can you. The Holy See is essentially the Pope's government. There are about 9 different congregations and even more pontifical councils that divide up the work and issues that the Church has to deal with. Diplomatic relations are handled by the Secretary of State. Congregation for Clergy handles all the issues about the 400,000 or so Catholic priests around the world. Pontifical Council for Culture is the office that interacts most with the real world. They're the ones who set up an exhibit at the Venice Biennale last year, and they are the ones who are backing the Vatican's new cricket team. The most important offices are the Secretariat of State and the newly created Secretariat for the Economy. That is just getting off the ground now. Pope Francis created it as part of his reform of the Vatican bureaucracy. And then there's the Vatican Bank, which has had quite a storied and scandalous history. Every day, the Vatican Press Office puts out a bulletin, or in Italian, bollettino. Italian is the official language, so everything is done in Italian. It comes out at noon, and there can be one bullettino, there can be 10, depending on what's happening that day. It usually includes the names of the people that the Pope has had audiences with that morning. Could be visiting bishops, visiting heads of state, visiting groups of Catholics. If it's a group of Catholic doctors, that speech might have a little nugget of news in it if he says something about abortion or euthanasia, something like that. With this Pope, though, what seems to make news isn't so much the scripted speeches, but those unscripted moments when you see Bergoglio the man come through. The time when he caressed a grossly disfigured man in St. Peter's Square, or the time when he told a little girl that he really didn't want to be Pope, or the time when he told a group of priests and nuns that they shouldn't really drive the fancy cars or have the latest iPhones, but should live humbly and simply. There are some formal occasions, though, that do require basic news coverage. We've had 2 of them recently. I missed one yesterday when Queen Elizabeth came to pay a visit, but I was there when President Obama was in town last week. When a head of state comes to visit the Pope, it's a pretty big deal, especially if it's Obama. Rows of Swiss guards line up in the main courtyard of the Apostolic Palace for the welcome. A small army of men in morning suits with medals on their lapels walk slowly down the palace halls, letting the president or prime minister that they're escorting admire the frescoes. And then they hand off the visitor to the Pope, and the 2 then go behind closed doors for a 20-minute private talk. For these head of state visits, the Vatican organizes what's known as pools, where they let a handful of reporters, photographers, and TV crews in to witness part of the event firsthand. And the deal is that we then provide to the rest of the reporters, the Vatican Press Corps, the images and information that we've seen so that everyone has equal access to the information. So in the case of the Obama visit, I was one of the 3 reporters who was up in the Pope's library when Obama came in. My colleagues and I dutifully wrote down everything that we could hear, which is not easy when you have a dozen photographers clicking away with their cameras. We leave the room for the real meat of the discussion, but we come back for the final photos and exchange of gifts. And after it was over, we then all went back to the Vatican press office and gave a full briefing to the rest of the press corps. We each reported what we had heard and seen so that everyone could have pretended that they were there as well. The interesting thing about that visit, though, came a few hours later when the Vatican issued a statement about what Obama and the Pope had talked about in their private meeting. The Vatican said they spoke about international conflicts, immigration, human trafficking, and what the Vatican called issues of concern to the U.S. Church: religious freedom, life, and conscientious objection. Now, anyone who's been paying attention to the Obama administration's relations with U.S. bishops knows that there are some pretty serious problems over the administration's Affordable Care Act, and in particular over the requirement that health care coverage include coverage for birth control and devices that can work after conception. So it was clear in the Vatican statement that the Vatican was very much backing the U.S. bishops in highlighting this area of disagreement with Obama. Well, a little while later, Obama held a press conference. He said that he and the Pope spent the bulk of their 52-minute meeting talking about income inequality and the poor, which are key priorities for both the President and the Pope. He said that he and the Pope actually didn't really talk much about the healthcare mandate. So who to believe? How do you write a story when both sides say different things were discussed in a private meeting that only they and their interpreters attended? It was tough. Each side had a reason for highlighting different issues. Obama wanted to show that he and the enormously popular Pope saw eye to eye on working to improve the plight of the poor. The Vatican wanted to show that it backed the U.S. bishops in their legal battles against the administration over the contraception mandate. The wiggle room apparently came in the fact that the Vatican statement referred to what was discussed in Obama's meetings with the Pope and his subsequent meetings with the Vatican II. Apparently that's where the healthcare mandate was discussed in greater detail. Now, one area that apparently didn't come up, but is of terrible importance to the Vatican and the U.S. Church, is sex abuse. And I don't think I need to go into great detail about how big a deal the abuse scandal has been for the U.S. Church. In the U.S. alone, dioceses and religious orders have spent more than $3 billion in settling lawsuits stemming from the thousands of people who were sexually abused by priests when they were minors. In Ireland, where the scandal erupted long before the U.S. explosion in 2002, the Church has lost much of its credibility. In the Netherlands, a church-funded report found that some 20,000 children were sexually abused in Dutch Catholic institutions over the past 65 years. The scandal has erupted in Germany and in Australia. Cases are starting to be reported in Latin America. In many places, the Church has responded with comprehensive programs to protect children, educate church personnel about what to look for, and better screen their priests. By now, it is pretty much commonly accepted that Pope John Paul II didn't really get it on sex abuse until very late. Under his papacy, the Vatican, like much of the rest of the Church, believed that the accusers were most often just out to get the Church with false accusations. Priests were defended even when there was overwhelming evidence against them. No one, including society at large, psychiatrists or the police, really realized the devastation and the trauma that children suffer when they are sexually abused. Benedict actually got it before a lot of people. He was head of the Vatican's Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which often heard from bishops wondering how to proceed with these problem priests. As early as 1988, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger asked the Vatican's legal office for a quicker way to remove priests rather than go through the cumbersome church trial that canon law required, but he was turned down. It wasn't until 2001 that Ratzinger was able to push through a major reform of how the Church handled these cases. He ordered all cases of sex abuse be sent to his office for review. He took control to make sure that the bishops did the right thing and disciplined the offending priests. Up until then, bishops were just moving the rapists around from parish to parish, diocese to diocese, rather than turning them into police. Based on recommendations from psychologists and their own desire to prevent scandal, these bishops thought that the pedophiles could be cured. So starting in 2001, the Vatican became the clearinghouse for these cases, and there were a lot of them. Benedict's sex crimes prosecutor once told me that he and Ratzinger would devote their Fridays to reviewing these cases. This prosecutor, Monsignor Charles Scicluna, told me that Benedict used to consider this work his Friday penance. It was that bad. In 2003 and 2004, Ratzinger's office did what he wanted to do in 1988 and made it possible to laicize a priest who had sexually abused a child without going through the church trial. A recent AP story that I did found that in his final 2 years as Pope, Benedict laicized nearly 400 priests because they were abusers. So Benedict is now pretty widely credited for having turned the church around on this issue. But to this day, the Vatican has yet to sanction a bishop who covered up for an abusive priest. Enter Pope Francis. Now, Argentina hasn't really had the explosion of abuse cases that we've seen elsewhere. That doesn't mean that there aren't victims and perpetrators out there. As we've seen, these things tend to crescendo. Victims often don't report these crimes because they're ashamed. But once people start coming forward, there's something of a tsunami effect where other people start to come forward, and so on. That hasn't really happened yet in Argentina. I don't know if it will, but history tends to suggest that no country or culture is immune. Now, Francis has said that while he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires, he never had to deal with a credible accusation against a priest. He has said he backs the tough line that Benedict imposed. But there are some who really question whether he gets it in the same way that Benedict did. Few people have had the hands-on experience with these cases that Benedict had. In December, Francis announced the creation of a sex abuse commission of experts to advise him and the Church on the best practices to protect children. The commission languished for 3 months. Nothing was done. No one was appointed. But recently, Francis announced the initial members of the group. Remarkably, half of them are women. That is major for the Vatican. Major. And even more remarkably, one of them is a victim herself. Her name is Marie Collins. She's Irish. She was sexually abused by a hospital chaplain when she was in the hospital when she was 13 years old. She went on to become a leading activist and critic of the church's handling of the scandal, demanding justice for victims and honesty from the church. And most importantly, she has demanded that the bishops who covered up for abusers, who failed to report them to police, be sanctioned. We'll see what happens. There are still a lot of unknowns about what this commission will and won't be able to accomplish. There are some in the church and in the Vatican who think that the church has already gone too far, that too many innocent priests have gotten caught up in the witch hunt. Another one of the members of this commission, though, is Cardinal Sean O'Malley. He's the Archbishop of Boston. He knows firsthand how bad the problem is because he had to go into Boston to clean up the mess after the scandal exploded there in 2002. O'Malley is also one of Pope Francis's top advisors. He's a Franciscan, so he and the Pope are very much on the same page. But we'll just have to see how this commission shakes out and whether any bishop will be sanctioned. For many victims and victims groups, that is the key test for Francis. For them, even the best child protection programs in the world will be meaningless if the people who covered up the crimes aren't punished. So I'm sorry, we kind of started on a bit of a downer, and I'm ending on a bit of a downer. But I think maybe this is a good place to leave off. There are a lot of things that I haven't talked about. I could go on, but I think it would be a good time to turn it over to you guys, and I would be happy to take any questions if you'd like. Anyone?
Hey.
Hey.
How's it going? This might have been asked yesterday during our session, but you identify yourself as a Catholic, correct?
I am a born and raised Catholic.
As a journalist, how do you feel that, does that play into, I guess, the whole ethics of journalism, covering something that's religious and you yourself identify as that religion?
I cover the Vatican as I would cover any other institution. I have covered the United Nations before, I've covered the US military before, and so I treat it as a bureaucracy. It is, however, I know, a bureaucracy that means an awful lot to an awful lot of people. So I go at it with an incredible amount of respect, both for my readership and for the person I'm covering. That doesn't amount to softball coverage. It amounts to, I hope, respectful coverage and informed critical coverage when necessary. But I try to keep it very separate. I hope, and I think every journalist, whenever they're covering anything, you don't want to let your personal opinions and beliefs enter into the equation. I don't think it does because it's just an institution to me.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
I was just wondering if working at the Vatican has had any profound influence on your faith. You said you did call yourself a Christian, correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's a similar response then. It's an institution that I cover, so I don't. It doesn't really affect me, and if anything, you never really want to see sausage being made. It's not a pretty process. So, seeing it up close can sour you a bit on the whole enterprise. So I'll leave it at that.
And then, sorry, one more question, kind of in a different phase. How does the Vatican actually make money?
Good question. And I'll get in. So the Holy See, which is the governance of the Universal Church, doesn't really make money. They spend money. The Vatican city-state, which is the territory, they make money. That's where the Vatican museums are. They make a lot of money. So Vatican city-state kind of bankrolls the government, but then you also have donations from dioceses every year. Dioceses, especially the U.S. diocese, the U.S. church kicks in an awful lot of money. The German church kicks in a lot of money. And every year the Vatican Bank, which is a very unique institution, they invest. They have a patrimony of their own. They invest it, and every year they cut the Pope 50 million euros for his own, not for the functioning of the Vatican, but for his own works of charity. So there are money-making enterprises going on, but the vast majority of the operating budget comes from the Vatican museums. That's the real cash cow.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
Good evening.
Hi.
First of all, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
You mentioned earlier that there's kind of a reconciliation between the Orthodox Patriarch and the Pope. Having covered the Vatican for over 10 years and 3 different popes, could you give a little more details about the relationship between the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church?
Sure. Okay, so quick history. Orthodox Catholic Church split about 1,000 years ago. John Paul, and going back to Vatican II, there was a real effort to mend the ties. You know, the Catholic Church wants to be united. So starting with Pope Paul VI, they had this historic meeting with Athenagoras, I think was the name of the ecumenical patriarch at the time. And ever since then, popes have had a very good relationship with the ecumenical patriarch based in Istanbul. What we still are, they haven't managed to do much work on is with the Russian Orthodox Church. So the Russian Church, which because of what happened to the church in the former Soviet Union, where the Orthodox Church thought that the Catholic Church was poaching believers, there's still quite a bit of animosity there, and so there has not been a meeting between a pope and the Russian Orthodox Patriarch. I don't know that that is on the horizon. It's been wished for since the time of John Paul, at least. I've been writing, maybe this year we'll have a meeting of the Russian Patriarch and the Pope. So I don't know that we're going to see any breakthroughs with Francis and Bartholomew meeting in Jerusalem. It will be a historic moment because they're recalling an anniversary, an important anniversary in the history of this effort to mend the schism. I don't know that anyone's expecting anything in the long or short term. But it's a process. It's a process of dialogue that everyone seems to be quite keen to continue. I believe Bartholomew was the first ecumenical patriarch to attend an installation of a pope. So that happened when Francis was installed. So little steps, but I don't think we're expecting any end of the Great Schism.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hello. I was just wondering how you remain objective and positive when reporting on such horrific issues like the sex scandal in the Catholic Church, and if you ever consider your job to be taxing.
Okay. Yeah, it's hard. It's a hard job. So it's it's tough. And the sex abuse story is absolutely devastating. You cannot talk to anyone who is a survivor of sexual abuse and not come away from it completely a changed person. So it's emotionally a difficult subject. I find that that is a really great motivator to write and to report. It's compelling, it's awful, you want to let it be known that this happened, you want to not let it be kept a secret, because that was part of the problem, was that it was kept quiet. So on that particular issue, it's horrific, and but writing about it actually is, I think, is important that the story be told, and that sense of importance then makes the writing it and the reporting of it more tolerable, because otherwise, yeah, it's devastating. So, yeah, but reporting is an emotional thing. I mean, if you're in a war zone, you're seeing people being killed. So I wouldn't dare compare, the emotional toll that I go through, interviewing someone to, a colleague who's just seen a child be blown up by a bomb. I mean, there's no comparison. So it comes with the territory. That's what we do. So.
Thank you.
Hi. Does being a woman make your job more difficult covering the papacy?
Interesting. I guess I can't answer that because I don't know what it's like to be a man covering the papacy. But it's unusual, and it was interesting. In the Obama press conference, there were some photos floating around, and some of my friends saw it and said, "You were the only woman there," and it didn't even occur to me that I was the only woman there. Journalism is, in many ways, still. I don't know what the numbers are, but maybe it's the Vatican, maybe the photographers are still heavily male because they can lug around the heavy equipment. But no, I think it is weird a little sometimes. You have to be careful what you wear. You can't race around in short skirts and stuff. You have to dress respectfully in the Vatican. You have to wear dark clothes when you go up to see the Pope, so modest clothing. So it's just a question of showing respect to the people that you're covering. But I've never felt discriminated against because I'm a woman. I've felt discriminated against because I'm an American, and I'm dealing with an Italian bureaucracy where the Italians who run the bureaucracy really could care less about the AP and anything outside of Italy. So that's more of the challenge, is finding people who will talk to me and not, disregard the AP just because they've never heard of it. Yeah. Okay.
I have to take this down. Okay. So a lot of the popular American media has come to depict Pope Francis as like a champion of social justice for a lot of liberal causes, especially within the gay rights community. His statement, "Who am I to judge?" has been taken to say that he fully supports homosexuality and all the issues that come with it. So I'm personally very surprised to hear that he does hold the more conservative views when it comes to the rights of these people and for other issues as well. So how do you think the American media, do you think it's an accurate representation when they say he's a champion of social justice? Or, what am I trying to say? How is the media skewing this? Is he being reconciled with his conservative views but liberal cause? How does this relationship play out?
Okay, I think again what we're seeing is a question of tone and emphasis. I mean, technically, church teaching holds that homosexuals should be treated with dignity and respect. That's there in the catechism. it also holds that homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered. So it depends on what one chooses to emphasize. Maybe before we had popes who emphasized more the intrinsically disordered aspect of church teaching on homosexuality, and now we have a pope who emphasizes more the gays should be treated with dignity and respect. So does Pope Francis think that homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered? I would have to say probably yes. Is he going to deny someone communion because of that? I don't think so. Does he think that gays have a right to participate in the life of the church? Absolutely. Again, he's not going to change church teaching on these core issues, but I think it's a question of what he's choosing to emphasize and how that fits into his view of what the church should be, which is this field hospital, a place of welcome where everyone can find a home, and that the rules, there are some essential ones out there, but we don't need to go over the top in emphasizing them.
Hi. In reading literature, hearing interviews from people, especially who are against the church, who are arguing points with the church, I've heard a lot about secret Vatican documents that are locked up and only certain people have access to them. I was just kind of wondering about, first of all, the existence of secret Vatican documents, but also about access to them, how you gain access to them, that kind of thing.
Good question. Okay. There is a lot of secrecy at the Vatican. Some of it is, Dan Brown-esque. We make a lot more of it than it really exists. There is something called the secret archives. In the last couple of years, we've had a secret report that cardinals commissioned for Benedict when a bunch of his papers were stolen from his butler. So there have been some issues recently where the secret world of the Vatican has been very much in the news. Fact is, there is no Freedom of Information Act at the Vatican, so you're kind of out of luck if you're trying to get a hold of something that is not available to the public. Generally, things don't leak, except for this one case where we had the butler who was leaking the Pope's papers. But a lot is actually public. You just have to know where to look for it. They don't make it easy. They don't tell you where stuff is. A lot of times it's in Latin. A lot of times it's, buried on a bookshelf somewhere. The story that I mentioned of these 400 priests that Benedict defrocked in his final 2 years as Pope, that was public information. Nobody ever knew. It was buried in a statistical yearbook that the Vatican puts out every year. And I only knew to look there because a colleague had obtained a document from Geneva that referenced this figure. And he asked me, he gave me this document, and I saw it, and I said, wow, that looks like it could be what I think it is, which is a number of priests who have been disciplined by Benedict for sex abuse. It's a number that has never been out there before. So I went to this statistical yearbook to see if indeed it had this information, and was shocked that it had been out there and nobody knew to look for it. They don't make it easy for you. So you just have to kind of know what's out there and take the time to go look for it. Sorry.
I get to be the last one? It's a two-part question, actually. The first one, and you've kind of answered it in the question about the Orthodox Church earlier, with the current situation in the Ukraine, with the economic and social and religious situation, the dynamics that are going on there right now, have you sensed any action, I guess, from the Vatican coming to where this might be an opportunity taken by the Pope to bridge the gap between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church in Russia? And the second part of my question is, If I give you my Twitter handle, can you get Pontifex to retweet me sometime?
I'll take the second one first. I don't think he retweets. I'm pretty sure he doesn't retweet. On Ukraine, I think on Ukraine they are staying back. They are not getting involved. The Pope has made maybe one or two brief interventions calling for, calm dialogue. Situations like Ukraine that would involve the Russian Orthodox Church, they don't want to make a big thing about, because that's just going to mess things up. So my sense is that they're hanging back on Ukraine.
Hi. You mentioned earlier that the press corps is very diverse in both ethnicity and beliefs, as they come from all around the world. So I'm curious as to how working and collaborating with them, and examples with like the different language groups, but actually when you all do come together, what have you learned from working with such a diverse group?
Good question. Yeah, the Vatican Press Corps, it's an interesting bunch. It's heavily Italian. The Italians can't get enough of Pope news, so every Italian newspaper has a Vatican correspondent or two. Sometimes TV newscasts lead with what the Pope says that day, something that we would never see in the U.S. So it's a heavily Italian press corps. I'd say the vast majority are pretty devout believers. Many of the reporters are former seminarians, so people who have a religious background. That helps just in knowing your way around. It helps in being familiar with how the church works, what the liturgical calendar of the year is, so that okay, this is the feast of X. To someone who's not familiar with that, there's such a huge learning curve to try to get up to speed with. So it's a very well-informed press corps. So I have learned an awful lot from them. There is a lot of religious media, so very Catholic media, which from a purely journalistic point of view, they're not critical. They're very docile, and they aren't challenging the institution as an institution that needs to be covered critically, in the same way that our State Department reporter isn't going to let the State Department get away with fudging an answer on a press conference. I think the Vatican Press Corps, because it is heavily religious, they don't have that tradition of challenge that I think the American media has. They're a great bunch of people. We have fun, especially on the trips. It's a good group, but we're competitors also. So everybody's trying to get a scoop, but it's not. No one's out to ambush one another or anything. So we collaborate when we need to, and we're on pools. It's a very generous group where you give everything you've got in your notebook. You don't keep anything back. Those are the rules. But it's competitive when the time calls for being competitive. So. Okay.